George W. Bush said after his presidency that history will judge him, and given how unpopular he was when he left office, that's the best he could hope for. But it wouldn't be the first time a president's legacy changed over the years. Sure, there were presidents like George Washington who were beloved in their time and remain beloved over 200 years later. Then there were presidents like Andrew Johnson, who sucked for their time, and upon historical reevaluation, it turns out they really sucked. For others though, their reputation is a lot more complicated. As values change, new eras arise, and more information becomes available, scholars and the public at large are always reevaluating the legacies of historical figures, and presidents are no different. Many are seen very differently today than they were even a generation ago. Welcome into the History Buffs Hub. In this video, we're going to take a look at the 10 presidents whose legacies have changed the most dramatically over time, for better or for worse. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button down below, and also ring the bell and turn on your notifications. Leave a comment too. Give your opinions. History Buffs Hub wants to cover anything history related, from politics to sports to pop culture, but we can't do it without your help. For this list, we're only looking at the legacies of presidents after they left office. Approval ratings while they are in the White House fluctuate too much to make that a factor. We're also only looking at how their presidency is viewed, not necessarily how they as individuals are viewed. For instance, Bush and Jimmy Carter are a lot more popular as people now than they ever were as presidents, but even as personal affinities for them have increased, nobody will accuse their presidencies of getting an unfair rep. This is solely about whose legacies as president have changed the most. Now let's dive in. Number 10, Abraham Lincoln. It's not like Abraham Lincoln was ever broadly unpopular, but the borderline deification of him by this country rivaling that of Washington himself was not how the public viewed him even at the time of his assassination in 1865. Although he was martyred immediately upon his death by the North, let's not forget half the country hated him and launched a civil war over him becoming president 5 years earlier. Lincoln's reputation actually took a bit of a hit in the 1870s as the disastrous second term of Ulysses S. Grant, which included the violence during the Reconstruction era and the Panic of 1873, partially brought about by the aftermath of the war, led many to believe it was a mistake to ever keep the South from seceding in the first place. However, after Reconstruction ended and reconciliation between the two regions began, unfortunately at the expense of any rights for freed black people in the South, Lincoln began to get more popular during the Gilded Age. By 1900, he was known as the Great Emancipator, seen by the North as having preserved the Union. Meanwhile, the South had conceded that had he lived, Reconstruction would have been handled a lot better than it was under Johnson or Grant. Lincoln's belief in expanding the role of the federal government to protect the rights of Americans underwent a major renaissance in the Progressive era too, as Teddy Roosevelt invoked his principles to justify his efforts to conserve public lands and regulate big business. It was around this time that he truly became deified, and construction on the Lincoln Memorial began in 1914. That memorial was dedicated then in 1922, and in between then, World War I happened, which increased the sense of national unity in this country and was only going to help the popularity of the man who saved the Union. Also in this time, the New South, a movement to move the old Confederacy away from its agrarian society, hit its apex as the Roaring Twenties saw the growth of industry in the southern states, and a new generation of Southerners who weren't around for the war were actually beginning to view Lincoln as somebody who was just trying to modernize the South, which it desperately needed. In the 1930s, Franklin D. Roosevelt also invoked Lincoln's stance on a strong centralized government to justify his New Deal policies and increase the welfare state, and after the U.S. became the sole superpower in the West at the end of World War II and American ideals began to spread rapidly across the world in the years that followed, Lincoln was all of a sudden seen as a global figure whose efforts may have saved democracy before it even got off the ground. Key figures of the civil rights movement, from Martin Luther King Jr. to John F. Kennedy, invoked Lincoln's legacy to push for equality, making him universally admired in the mid-20th century. Now, since that time, Lincoln's reputation has actually taken a bit of a hit. In the post-Vietnam War era, historians have reevaluated his initial moderate stance on slavery and hesitancy to end it. His brutal tactics to win the war have been seen by some as unnecessary and maybe even war crimes, such as Sherman's March to the Sea, where Union General William Tecumseh Sherman invoked a scorched earth policy, a military campaign in which he burned supplies, infrastructure, and property throughout Georgia to cause immense suffering to the southern population. Then there's the trampling on civil liberties, where he arrested political opponents and held them in prison without a trial, and also shut down newspapers he saw as too friendly to the Confederacy. However, he's still consistently rated as the best president in U.S. history. None of his drawbacks really hold weight, as despite his public statements, he was prepared to take a much more aggressive stance against slavery than any mainstream politician was or even legally could in 1860. His ruthless efforts during the war were only after the South refused to surrender despite invading the Union twice and causing immense suffering there. And honestly, he was within his right to trample on civil liberties, as the Constitution literally says the writ of habeas corpus may not be suspended except in times of rebellion. I mean, the Civil War does count as a rebellion. Number 9. Lyndon B. Johnson. It's not like he's a beloved president now, but Lyndon B. Johnson's legacy has undergone a pretty dramatic transformation in left-wing circles. By the time he left office in 1969, LBJ's legacy was shattered. The Vietnam War completely undercut his standing with his base, which included minorities, modern liberals, and the counterculture left. Southern Democrats had already turned on him for supporting civil rights legislation, and small government conservatives were obviously going to despise him for his expansion of the federal government with his Great Society programs, which is why he didn't even seek his party's nomination for re-election in 1968. However, as memories of Vietnam faded, much of the left has come back home to LBJ. Barack Obama's presidency, where his party had a filibuster-proof Senate and the largest majorities in both chambers of Congress in over 30 years, but couldn't pass anything more than a Republican-proposed healthcare plan from the 90s and a Wall Street regulation bill that many Democrats themselves voted to partially repeal a decade later, led to the left's nostalgia for LBJ. From the Civil Rights Act to the Voting Rights Act, to Medicare, to Medicaid, to fair housing, to clean water, to financial aid for college, to significantly reducing food insecurity in children, to bringing electricity to all of rural America, to ending racial quotas and immigration, LBJ's presidency is now viewed as the peak of modern liberalism in America and what the left sees as possible if they get a president actually willing to fight. Even those who aren't on the left are forced to give him credit for civil rights and Medicare. Nobody could win an election if they ran on repealing either of those things. That Johnson was a Southern Democrat who had the political courage to betray his caucus and his own voting history once he reached the White House by ramming through such significant civil rights legislation can't be overlooked. He did so within a year of taking over after John F. Kennedy's assassination, and as more information comes to light about how slow JFK was to move on civil rights compared to the sometimes brutal political tactics LBJ used to move on it, many can't help but appreciate his political will. Civil rights and the Great Society have improved LBJ's legacy from horrible to okay or even above average. Unfortunately for him, it's always going to have a ceiling though, for two primary reasons. Conservatives will understandably never be a fan of his because of how much he expanded the federal government, and even the left can't ignore how bad he was on Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers did him a bit of a break as they revealed that it was actually Dwight Eisenhower, not LBJ, who started the US involvement in Vietnam, but those papers also revealed the level of lies and deceit LBJ applied to gin up public support for massively escalating the war in the draft in 1965. He has the blood of 58,000 dead American soldiers and countless others who were wounded on his hands, not to mention roughly 2 to 3 million Vietnamese civilians killed. There's just no way around that. Number 8. Warren G. Harding. This one changed pretty quickly. Elected as a Republican solely due to the unpopularity of Democratic President Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding followed through on his return to normalcy campaign pledge by embracing the laissez-faire classical economic policies of the Gilded Age, withdrawing the U.S. from the world stage, and releasing all political prisoners who had spoken out against U.S. involvement in World War I. This ushered in the Roaring Twenties, which helped his popularity soar, and amidst that soaring popularity, just over 2.5 years into his term, he died of a heart attack in August of 1923. At the time of his death, Harding was beloved and borderline martyred. However, pretty quickly, personal corruption derailed Harding's legacy. The Teapot Dome scandal, in which Harding's Interior Secretary Albert Fall was eventually convicted of issuing no-bid contracts to oil companies for bribes in return, was already the subject of a Senate investigation. 2 months after Harding's death, Senate hearings on the investigation began, and by 1924, it became increasingly clear that Fall was guilty. What's more, Harding's Attorney General, Harry M. Daugherty, had become the subject of several corruption investigations, having used his power at the Justice Department to suppress investigations into several other corrupt Harding appointees, all of whom were known as members of the Ohio Gang, a group of cronies who rose through the ranks of the Republican establishment in Ohio with Harding and were then given positions in the federal government upon Harding's ascendance to the presidency. This seriously damaged Harding's personal reputation. The Great Depression and the onset of World War II over the next decade further discredited him, given the fact that US policy in the 1920s is blamed for both, and it also became increasingly clear to many that he was too stupid to ever be president, evidenced by the revelation in 1935 that he once said, quote, "I am not fit for this job and never should have been here." Harding's legacy has never recovered, but he was popular initially after his presidency. Number 7. Grover Cleveland. During and after his presidency, Grover Cleveland's legacy had been a roller coaster. After all, before Donald Trump, he was the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms while losing an election in between them. Cleveland was the first Democrat elected after the Civil War, breaking a streak of 6 straight elections won by Republicans. His second term was marred by the Panic of 1893 and the fracturing of his party as populists abandoned the Democrats due to his suppression of labor. He left office so unpopular that William McKinley won the election of 1896 and ushered in the 4th party system and eventually the Progressive Era. At the time, there was even discussion of Cleveland as the worst president ever. However, barely a decade later upon his death in 1908, his reputation was already changing. This was at the height of the Progressive Era, and a hallmark of that was Teddy Roosevelt standing up to corrupt political machines. Cleveland built his reputation doing that during his political rise in New York to the presidency. When the United States became radically isolationist in the 1920s after World War I, Cleveland's reputation as the last anti-interventionist president up until that point also significantly helped him. Then came the Great Depression, which dwarfed the Panic of 1893 in terms of economic calamity, so the negatives of that didn't seem to hurt Cleveland as much. In fact, when Franklin D. Roosevelt was running for president in 1932, sound money was a central theme of his campaign, a promise he would break within his first 100 days. Anyway, Cleveland was famous for his sound money policy and strengthening the gold standard, which he did at the height of the panic. The fact that the panic started under his predecessor, Benjamin Harrison, after Harrison added silver to the national currency, made Cleveland come across as somebody whose hands were tied during the panic. FDR and Cleveland, both being Democrats, also helped Cleveland, with Republicans' reputations destroyed due to the Depression. 100 years later, though, it's actually conservatives who hold a higher opinion of Cleveland, as he stands as a beacon for limited government and somebody who used the executive branch to curb the excesses of Congress, vetoing nearly 600 bills, more per term by far than any president in history. Number 6. Calvin Coolidge. Taking office upon the death of Harding, Coolidge's presidency ended wildly popular just like Harding's. His reputation also took a big hit shortly after his presidency, just like Harding's. However, unlike Harding, his reputation has enjoyed a bit of a comeback in recent years, most notably with certain American voter bases, similar to Johnson. Coolidge is the president most closely associated with the Roaring Twenties, and he enjoyed the political benefits of it by winning his own election by a pretty substantial margin in 1924. He then pledged to not seek another term in 1928, and Herbert Hoover ran as his Republican successor while riding on the coattails of his popularity. At the time, Coolidge was beloved for his character and the good times happening in the country. Just over 7 months after he left office, though, the stock market crash of 1929 hit, triggering the Great Depression. Almost overnight, Coolidge's credibility in polite society had tanked. While Hoover is the president most closely associated with the worst moments of the Depression, Coolidge's actions are directly blamed for its cause. His support for limited government and deregulation is blamed for the crash, his lack of support for the farm sector during the 20s is blamed for the severity of the Dust Bowls, and his continuation of Harding's isolationist foreign policy is directly blamed for the rise of Nazi Germany in World War II. Coolidge was very aware of the hit his reputation would take in history during the Depression. As the appetite for government intervention increased, he said, quote, "We are in a new era to which I do not belong, and it would not be possible for me to adjust to it." If only he could have stayed alive for another 50 years, though, he would have seen another resurgence. As stagflation gripped the nation under Jimmy Carter in the 1970s and the seeds for the Reagan Revolution were being laid, Coolidge's reputation made a comeback among conservative Republicans. Government intervention was seen as the problem for the 70s, and that led to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, who was very clear about his admiration for Coolidge. A growing rejection of Keynesian economics also led people to rethink the Depression. Among conservative intellectuals, particularly libertarians, the idea took hold that the Depression was just the natural market correction of the post-war economic boom, and that government intervention, not inaction, is what worsened the problem. They argue the Smoot-Hawley tariffs and federal public works projects under Hoover were the real problem and would never have been supported by Coolidge. And they also argue that FDR just lengthened the Depression with the New Deal. It certainly helped Coolidge's reputation that it's well documented he only begrudgingly supported Hoover in 1928 and openly acknowledged their differences in governing philosophy. Eventually, this thought reached the mainstream with the book The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression by Amity Shlaes, who was co-chair of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation Board. That and the rise in support for libertarian economics, evidenced by the growing popularity of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which was panned when it first came out in the 1950s, by the way, has dramatically helped Coolidge's reputation. Also, in the post-civil rights movement era, some on the left have had to rethink Coolidge's reputation too, as he signed legislation granting Native Americans U.S. citizenship, tried to get federal anti-lynching laws passed, and, despite his small government positions, appropriated significant funding for HBCUs, most notably a $500,000 grant for Howard's medical school, in what he cited was a dire need to increase the number of black doctors and expand the black middle class. Number 5. Thomas Jefferson. Beyond the presidency, Thomas Jefferson's reputation is complex enough. He wrote the Declaration of Independence and is the face of the positive values associated with America, from individual liberty to democracy, but at the same time he was a slave owner who fathered multiple children with one of his own slaves, Sally Hemings, and that's just one example of the most contradictory legacy in American history. Jefferson's legacy as president is no different. It's the subject of wild swings in popularity at different times throughout American history. Immediately upon leaving office in 1809, he was actually hated by the public as the economic catastrophe caused by the Embargo Act of 1807, which was a trade embargo on all foreign nations in an attempt by America to assert its neutrality during the Napoleonic Wars, really wrecked a lot of people's livelihoods. It killed Jefferson's reputation among farmers, who suffered greatly from the move and were his voter base. The ensuing War of 1812 under James Madison and expansion of slavery due to the Louisiana Purchase further complicated his legacy, and it was very clear he left a mess for future presidents to deal with once the Compromise of 1820 was enacted. However, with the rise of Jacksonian politics under Andrew Jackson in the 1820s and 30s, Jefferson's presidency was seen in a new light. Opposition to the national bank was widely seen as in line with Jefferson's opposition to central banking, and the growing imperialist belief of manifest destiny among Americans was seen as a continuation of Jefferson's ideals, where the country would be a nation of farmers spread out across the land. With James K. Polk doubling the size of the country as president in the 1840s, most notably by adding Texas, Jefferson became beloved for getting the ball rolling on manifest destiny with the Louisiana Purchase. As slavery became the central issue facing the nation, Jefferson's presidency was at the core of the debate between Jacksonian Democrats and Whigs and eventual Republicans. The abolitionists cited Jefferson's expansion of federal powers, specifically with the Louisiana Purchase, as evidence that the federal government had the legal authority and duty to end slavery. Both sides claiming that they were adhering to his legacy during the Civil War only further increased his popularity. After Reconstruction, though, Jefferson's presidency took another hit. The Gilded Age saw America shift from an agrarian society that Jefferson pushed for with his presidency to one of industrial power, and he began to be seen as somebody who stalled inevitable progress with his agenda. There was also no way to ignore Jefferson's commitment to states' rights, and the South wrapping itself up in that with the lost cause narrative of the Civil War, where they claimed that that's what the war was only about, only made him look worse. The expansion of the federal government during the Progressive Era to create a national currency and regulate big business even further lessened his popularity, as Alexander Hamilton had a revival among the Founding Fathers during this time period due to his support for a national bank. After World War I, though, Jefferson's popularity underwent a significant revival again, largely due to the increased sense of national unity the country felt, even if they opposed getting involved in the war, and his face was among the 4 chosen to be put on Mount Rushmore when construction began in 1927. During the Great Depression, Jefferson became even more popular as FDR framed his New Deal programs as fulfilling Jefferson's legacy as a president of the common man. Jefferson's American ideals had another renaissance after World War II and during the Cold War, as they were seen as central to opposing communism, and it also vindicated another decision he made as president, which was to establish West Point. There's no way the U.S. would have been as effective as it was in World War II without a standing army, and West Point was a huge part of that. Of course, after the 1960s, despite invoking Jefferson's language to make its case, the civil rights movement gave his legacy another hit beyond just the personal front. The way his policies expanded slavery came back to the forefront, even though he banned the slave trade in 1807, the first year the Constitution actually allowed the federal government to do so. It also became hard to ignore that he was an early advocate for forcing indigenous people who didn't assimilate to American culture off their ancestral homelands, and he proposed the first Indian Removal Act that served as the inspiration for the Trail of Tears 2 decades later. All of this is to say, Jefferson's presidential legacy is as wildly complicated as his personal legacy, and while historians usually rank him among the top 5 presidents of all time, he wasn't always there, and even to this day, it's a matter of serious debate as to whether or not his presidency itself was actually a net positive or a net negative for human rights, even if it's what he supposedly stood for. Number 4. Harry Truman. No president in recorded history completed his last term in office with a lower approval rating than Harry Truman. Rising to the presidency on the death of FDR to win World War II and then win his own election in 1948, Truman was blamed for the supply shortage and out-of-control inflation that was the result of the end of the war. He was seen as ineffective in fighting the growing threat of communism globally with the fall of China to Mao in 1949, and he was wildly unpopular for getting involved in the Korean War to protect South Korea from communist invasion given the fact that it ended in a stalemate. Firing beloved War General Douglas MacArthur for criticizing him for not being aggressive enough in the Korean War only further hurt his reputation. And he was honestly seen as just too unrefined or blue-collar to hold the job on the heels of the pristine New York elitists in FDR. As a result, he didn't even seek his own party's nomination in the 1952 presidential election, which saw Dwight Eisenhower take back the White House for Republicans for the first time in 20 years. With Eisenhower's presidency ushering in the golden age of the American economy, Truman's popularity suffered even more, and in 1960, Truman's opposition to John F. Kennedy in the Democratic primary was actually seen as an asset to JFK. However, the seeds of Truman's comeback and his reputation were laid during the Eisenhower presidency with the fall of Joe McCarthy. The Red Scare of the early 1950s severely damaged Truman, but the death of McCarthyism in 1954, as Edward R. Murrow exposed the senator to be a total fraud with his anti-communist fear tactics, was Truman's first bit of vindication. In the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement, Western Europe's rebounding economy, and the Vietnam disaster led to Truman being seen in a new light. As the Democratic Party wrapped itself up in support of civil rights, many credited Truman for getting that ball rolling, as he desegregated the military, banned discrimination in federal employment, and refused to back down to the Southern Democrats who blackmailed him with a third-party challenge for supporting such things. In fact, he declared open war on their eventual party, the Dixiecrats, and their nominee in the 1948 presidential election, Strom Thurmond, which bought him a lot of goodwill with the black community. During that time, Western Europe had undergone a sustained period of peace, and the country's economies were by and large doing well, so the Marshall Plan that Truman implemented to rebuild that area after World War II was now seen as an effective move. Vietnam created a level of nostalgia for Truman's cautious approach to fighting communism as well. It was so much worse in the Korean War, and although the Vietnam War is actually rooted in Truman backing a return to French control of the region against the wishes of its people, to the public, LBJ's mishandling of it made Truman look extremely competent. Despite the debates over it, he was also still widely credited with ending World War II by making the decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and whatever your opinions are on that, the public grew sympathetic to the incredibly tough position he was in. This era was also the golden age of Western movies, so Truman's rugged, brash image became more of a positive that turned him into more of an American folk hero who displayed the honesty and integrity that should be demanded of the office. Something that was appreciated even more after his death in 1972, when the Watergate scandal exploded and resulted in President Richard Nixon's resignation from office in 1974. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the final vindication for Truman's Cold War policies to many people. That period marked the height of the popularity of NATO, which Truman established, and historians and Americans at large have both consistently ranked him as a top 10 president since then. There's now more scrutiny directed at Truman because of the bombs and his imperialist nature, as he supported a return to European colonialism in Asia and Africa after the war, which directly contradicted FDR's ideas, but most historians believed he was making a judgment call there to fight what he perceived as a greater threat in communism, so it hasn't hurt his legacy too much. Of course, Truman also established the CIA, very unpopular with anti-imperialists, but it became much more imperialist under Eisenhower than Truman likely ever intended it to be. Number 3. Ulysses S. Grant. A second term marred by corruption in his cabinet and the failure of Reconstruction after the Civil War would damage Ulysses S. Grant's legacy for over 100 years. He left office wildly unpopular and was seen as a corrupt and incompetent drunk who really only won the war for the Union as a general because of his numbers advantage. Nobody who would defend Grant's legacy during his time in office was interested in doing so because nothing he did seemed to have a positive, lasting impact. His presidency ended with the rise of Jim Crow, and it would take black people who had just been freed another 100 years to truly secure their rights. It doesn't help that in the attempt to deify Lincoln that we discussed earlier, Southerners would lump Grant and Johnson together with their lost cause narrative and view their mismanagement of Reconstruction as the cause of future problems. However, modern historians have come to appreciate Grant's commitment to fighting for civil rights during Reconstruction and his use of the federal government to take on the racist of his time. With the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, Grant invoked the Insurrection Act to fight them, and other white supremacist terrorist organizations too. White Southerners were not ready to concede black rights after the war, and Grant was prepared to effectively continue the war to make sure black people could vote, own property, and hold public office. Seeing a president of that time so willing to take on the racist has cast him in a new light, and even though his efforts failed, it has rejuvenated his legacy. Most people now understand Reconstruction's failure is much more on Andrew Johnson in the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's death, and that because of his decisions, it was doomed the minute Grant stepped into the White House. Seriously, I can't stress this enough, Johnson sucks in every way possible. Number 2, Woodrow Wilson. The most hated president online was actually among the most beloved before the internet existed, and even warranted consideration for the greatest president ever in the mid-20th century by many historians. Yet Woodrow Wilson left office more unpopular than any outgoing president in history at the time, and his popularity is now just as bad as it was then. So he went from universally hated to universally loved to universally hated again, all within a century. The extremes of Wilson's legacy are insane. When Wilson left office in 1921, he was despised, and for good reason. He had broken his re-election pledge to keep the United States out of World War I just 3 months into his second term back in 1917. He jailed political opponents of the war, and he presided over the Spanish flu pandemic and outbreak of the post-war economic depression. Wilson saw the U.S. entry into the war as an opportunity to fulfill his belief in spreading democracy across the globe, which was central to him issuing his 14 points on principles of peace and helping to found the League of Nations. But he was so unpopular, he couldn't even get the US to join the League of Nations, and that undercut his standing on the global stage with the Treaty of Versailles to end the war, where he opposed punishing Germany as harshly as the treaty eventually did. Amidst that backdrop, Warren G. Harding won the 1920 election on a return to normalcy, which implied an outright rejection of what was known as Wilsonianism, the idea that the US had a role to play on the world stage. Although James Cox was the Democratic candidate, Wilson was so hated that Harding never even had to mention Cox, and he just campaigned against Wilson. Seriously, nobody at the time had ever left office more unpopular than Wilson, and the rejection of his ideology led to a 12-year period of complete Republican control of Congress and the presidency, and not just Republican control, but control by the business wing of the Republican Party, who opposed the Progressive Era, practiced laissez-faire economics, and was committed to U.S. isolationism. And with the Roaring '20s underway, Wilson's legacy seemed destined for the dustbin of history. But then the Great Depression happened. Then the Nazis took over Germany. Then World War II broke out. Then the US was forced to get involved in the war because it was attacked. Then Wilson looked like a prophet. FDR's New Deal programs to combat the Depression in the 1930s were seen as a continuation of the Progressive Era that Wilson was so instrumental in bringing about with his creation of the Federal Reserve, Federal Trade Commission, and passage of the 16th Amendment to establish the income tax. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy, FDR already espoused Wilson's foreign policy and applied that to World War II with much more political support than Wilson had in World War I. Truman finished the job, applying the same philosophy, and by 1945, with the revelation of the Holocaust, the global consensus was that turning away from Wilson's ideals in the 1920s caused the worst economic crisis, the worst genocide, and the worst war in world history, all within a span of roughly a decade. The US's post-war strategy, from the creation of the United Nations to the Marshall Plan, was just a copycat of everything Wilson proposed after World War I, and the country hated him when he was proposing those things. It was the ultimate I told you so of I told you so's of all time for Wilson, who died before any of this happened, and in Truman's fiery 1948 campaign to win his shocking election, he made sure everybody remembered that Republicans were responsible for the conditions that led to those tragedies by turning away from Wilson. With America as a superpower by this point, Wilson was deified. Even FDR's legacy remained behind Wilson's in the eyes of historians during this time, and as modern American liberalism from an economic perspective peaked in the 1960s, so did Wilson's legacy. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, though, cast Wilson's legacy in a different light, as he was a raging racist, even for his time. He resegregated the federal government while president, screened the abhorrently racist Birth of a Nation film, which depicts the KKK as the heroes, at the White House, and did nothing to curb the anti-black riots that occurred throughout the nation after the war. Still, Wilson's legacy was largely okay due to America's standing in the world, but that took a big hit during the 2000s. George W. Bush's abject failure with the Iraq War, which was promoted with Wilsonian language like spreading democracy in the Middle East, led to a reevaluation of American foreign policy and whether the US should truly be the country that polices the world. Isolationism has since begun to rise again, and with that has come a more outright rejection of Wilsonianism. The debate over civil liberties that returned to the forefront under Bush with his signing of the Patriot Act also hurt Wilson, as it brought back the stories of him jailing anti-war protesters. Now, retroactive analysis puts Wilson on the opposite side of most American citizens when it comes to the three most passionate issues the country always grapples with: racism, imperialism, and civil liberties. Now, all Wilson has to really fall back on is his continuation of the progressive era, but many of those things are unpopular with the American right, and Teddy Roosevelt is always going to be the face of that era anyway. As a result, his legacy has collapsed once again, and he now may even be more hated than he was when he left office. Before we reach our president whose legacy has changed the most over time, I want to address a couple of honorable mentions. Dwight Eisenhower was seen by historians as a forgettable, hands-off, do-nothing president when he left office in 1961, but his seemingly measured approach to the Cold War, his use of federal troops to enforce the desegregation of public schools, and his progressive legislation like the Interstate Highway Act cast him in a new light by the 1980s, and private writings that were made public revealed he was very much in control of his administration. He didn't make the list though because it was just historians who changed their opinion, not the public. Eisenhower had a high approval rating throughout his presidency, and he has a high one now, so it's not much of a change for his legacy. John Adams was seen as the most forgettable founding father to be president, the only one to lose his re-election bid in 1800, and him signing the Alien and Sedition Acts were never going to help his legacy. However, with the rise of democracy across the globe, his decision to accept his own election loss is now seen as groundbreaking, and it's certainly much more appreciated today given events that have happened within the last decade alone. He's also credited now for preventing a full-scale war with France, which could have happened, and his diplomatic approach to foreign policy. And the number one presidential legacy that has changed the most over time? Andrew Jackson. The first true populist president, Andrew Jackson rose to power on the backs of white non-landowners who were increasingly gaining the right to vote in the 1820s. Jackson became president by railing against the financial sector and the government institutions embedded within them having their proverbial foot on the common man. With this sort of politics, he founded the modern-day Democratic Party, and while he has always been a polarizing figure, even for his time, he was invoked for 150 years by populist candidates. Even those not as familiar with his policies admired his candidness, brashness, and willing to take on his political foes. Progressivism, like Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal, FDR's New Deal, Truman's Fair Deal, and JFK's New Frontier, along with LBJ's Great Society, are all inspired by Jacksonian politics, which laid the groundwork that the government belongs to the common man, not the wealthy few. However, like so many other presidents on this list, Jackson's legacy changed with the civil rights movement. It turns out, once you view non-white people as humans, you have a hard time looking past the genocide of Native Americans he employed with the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act, and you can't really ignore a president who actively expanded slavery and suppressed abolitionists more than any other president in history. Jackson used his political influence to push for many of the gag orders in Congress that banned the discussion of slavery, he packed the courts with pro-slavery judges, and he used his influence to support free states' efforts to disenfranchise black people, notably in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. Yes, black people's struggles and the fight for justice actually took a major step back under him. Given the modern-day Democratic Party's connection with minority voters, there's no feasible way for them to identify with their founder at all. And within the past decade, they have canceled their Jefferson-Jackson dinners, which is the name for fundraising dinners the party held in honor of Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson dating back to 1830. Beyond racial issues, the economic progressivism that invokes Jackson's name is not really a thing among scholars anymore either. Sure, he dismantled the National Bank, and prominent left-wing politicians are known today for their hostility to banking practices, but that hostility is toward private banks. Jackson was just opposed to the institution that created a national currency system, which has broad support among traditional progressives. His brand of populism was one of libertarianism that doesn't distinguish between government institutions and private business elites, which is significantly different from the progressivism of the 20th century, which believed that the government was there to curb the abuses of the business class. Simply put, every aspect of Jacksonian politics is at odds with what defines the modern-day Democratic Party, and Republicans aren't about to defend his extremely racist legacy either. Hopefully. As a result, his reputation has taken a major hit, and it's likely only going to get worse as time goes on. Thanks for hopping into the History Buffs Hub to watch this video. Which president's legacy would you say has changed the most over time? Please tell us in the comments, and once again, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more history videos in the future.